because this might be the inner chronicle of what we are, and we have to articulate ourselves, otherwise we would be cows in a field.
Welcome to Cows in the Field. This is a show in which we discuss philosophical themes in popular films. My name is Justin.
And I'm Laura.
Today we kick off spooky season with a conversation about maybe our favorite Gothic horror film, Bram Stoker's Dracula. And we're happy to welcome back to the show Bilge Ebiri. Bilge is a critic for New York Magazine and Vulture, and he also has written many great essays in the Criterion Collection. And if you want, you can also look at some of his other writing, which has appeared in Rolling Stone, The New York Times, and RIP The Village Voice. About this movie, Bilge has said, "I have seen Bram Stoker's Dracula something like 10 times, and I still can't bleeping believe this movie exists." Welcome, Bilge.
Hello, how are you?
On that note, Bilge, so you've seen this movie 10 times or more, but you saw it first in 1992 in a theater at a press screening. Tell us, bring us back.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think in 1992, I could have probably said this was my most anticipated movie of the year. I was in college, and I think it might have even been my most anticipated movie in 1991 too, because the I will say the marketing buildup to Bram Stoker's Dracula was phenomenal. Um, Coppola had kind of made a comeback. This was the film he did after Godfather Part 3, which was the film he made after, I believe, Tucker, The Man in His Dream. So he had kind of had a number of films that were very well regarded after a period when I think when conventional wisdom had it that he had sort of his career had almost fallen off a cliff.
Like the
I don't think this is
80s.
accurate, by the way. Yeah,
Yeah.
the 80s. I mean, 80s Coppola is actually great, but it wasn't, Godfather 1 and 2, Conversation, Apocalypse Now Coppola. So people sort of saw him as kind of being on the outs, and also he'd had a lot of financial difficulties and stuff. So, but he had kind of made a comeback. Godfather Part 3 was very well received at the time. It was nominated for a bunch of Oscars. I know its reputation has since kind of gone up and down and up and down, but back then it was kind of like, okay, Coppola's back. And they had these. I mean, there was this announcement he was making Bram Stoker's Dracula. There was, of course, the fact that Winona Ryder had been cast in Godfather Part 3 initially, but had to leave. And that was the one thing that at the time people were like, oh God, Godfather Part 3 would have been so great if Sofia Coppola wasn't in that part and Winona Ryder had stayed on. All of which I disagree with, but that was the conventional wisdom at the time. So now it was, Coppola is back. He's with Winona Ryder. He's got Gary Oldman. He's got Anthony Hopkins. He's got Keanu Reeves. And then the teaser trailers were fantastic. I think there was this sense that he was going to be faithful to the novel, in part because it was called Bram Stoker's Dracula. And there was this real sense that, he was probably going to do for, I mean, I think he even said this, but, to do for the vampire movie or the horror movie what he had done for the gangster movie with The Godfather. So everybody was really excited about this movie. And at the time, I had started an arts magazine on campus with my roommate at the time, and this was, I believe, our first issue. We managed to get on a bunch of press screening lists, so we would get invites to go to. We were in New Haven at Yale, but then like there would be screenings in like Orange, Connecticut. There'd be screenings in Hartford. There'd be screenings in like West Haven. And then I would sometimes come into New York for screenings as well. In fact, I remember I saw Malcolm X at the Warner Brothers screening room at the time.
Wow.
But yeah, so I went to see Dracula at, I don't remember which theater it was. It wasn't like a press screening room. It was like a theater where it was like the equivalent of what would be an all media now, but it was in Connecticut, so it wasn't like there weren't a lot of people there. And how do I describe it? I was shocked by what I saw.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
I was shocked. I thought it was at times hilarious, but also I was like hugely disappointed.
Yeah.
Like I was just like, this is fucking crazy. Like what happened? Um, he has gone completely insane. And I think, and I read, I was trying to find this before we got on. I was trying to find that old issue of our magazine to find my review. I was going to read it to you guys. Um, but the gist of it was that Francis Ford Coppola had completely lost his mind.
Uh-huh.
um,
I think that's a
and
fair assessment, honestly. I mean, even if you loved it, you might have thought that too. I think, yeah.
yeah, no, and it wasn't like I hated it. I was absolutely fascinated by it because it was just so many choices, most of which I thought were wrong, but like such bold choices. I mean, it was clearly, I mean, and I was a film major already. I mean, this was early in college, but I was a film major very early on. So I was, I was familiar with like film history and classics and all that. But I feel like this might have been one of the first times when I was confronted or was aware that I was being confronted with a filmmaker making really bold, sharp choices. Like choices that were like, "Oh, why did he do that?" Like, because very often you watch a film and it all, there's a certain transparency built into film. I mean, I think a lot of filmmakers even feel that way. It's like, if you can notice me directing, I've done something wrong.
Yeah.
But then here comes Coppola with fucking Bram Stoker's Dracula, which if you can notice me directing, you're probably just watching the movie because there's
You are awake. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it is just choice after choice after choice, and it all seems so counterintuitive.
Yeah.
And I remember I was again, I was shocked, but weirdly delighted too. I went back and saw it again not long after because I had seen it. I had seen it. I brought a guest with me. I can't remember who it was. It would have been one of my roommates or like, the guy across the hall who had the car,
Right.
But then, we went to see it when it came out. So I went and saw it again. And again, everybody was really disappointed. They were all shocked. We all thought one of my roommates was a huge Godfather fan, like Godfather Part 2 were like his favorite movies. And they like he had the VHSs on like constantly. So we were like marinated in Coppola fandom. Um and then it was like, what is he doing? What is going on? Like um and and so but that's the thing about a movie like that is that you're fascinated by the decisions, even if you're perplexed by them. And then you come back to it over and over again. And over the years, I've come back to it so many times. I mean, when the Laserdisc came out, like Criterion put out a Laserdisc of it. It was one of their first kind of really big, fancy Laserdiscs where um, they actually had this feature on it where um, you could edit scenes together like differently. It was
What?
it was very rudimentary. It was a
Huh.
very rudimentary thing. Back then, I
Wow.
mean, it would look ridiculous today, but they have since tried to recreate a more complex version of that, and I believe they were trying to do that when they put out Tree of Life on Blu-ray. And I think that was the plan. That's what they were going to do, and then like halfway through, I think they abandoned it because it just wasn't working. But there has always been this attempt at Criterion to try and kind of create this almost interactive version of these movies. Um, and I bought that Laserdisc, like for a movie you don't like. I mean, these Laserdiscs, they're like $125
Yeah.
Laserdiscs. Like, I'm a college kid. I don't have any money. So like I must not have hated it because I wanted to keep coming back and watching it. And that tweet that you mentioned, that was several years ago. The Quad showed it, I believe here, and I went and saw it, and it was the first time I'd seen it on a big screen in a long time.
Mm.
Over the years, I mean, when it's come out on DVD, I bought it on DVD. When it came out on Blu-ray, I bought it on Blu-ray. I guess there's like a 4K coming up. I'll buy that too, I'm sure. Um, but but now I love it. I mean, now it's fantastic.
Mm.
I don't remember when I turned. Like, I don't remember when I was like, "Oh, no, wait, I'm wrong. This movie is, like, one of the best things this dude's ever done." But over the years, I've just become I went from, like, morbid fascination to, delighted fascination, and I think he was sometimes that's what it means to be faced with, like, a visionary filmmaker. Because that's the thing, like, so many of the films that we love now were not loved when they first came out, and a lot of people were really perplexed by them. I mean, I was a big Barry Lyndon fan as a kid, but I wasn't around when Barry Lyndon was first released, and I remember a lot of the responses to Barry Lyndon at the time were like, why is he doing this? Like, what's wrong with him? Like, why is he choosing to tell this story in that way when we know that he can tell the story in all these other ways that he's done before, you know?
I think that's a big part of the many people's reaction to this film. It was my reaction too, and I think maybe Laura's as well. But we were coming to this movie from The Godfather. I don't think there are many people who are just seeing Dracula who you're just coming. I mean, maybe they are, but people who know it's Coppola are coming in with
Mhm,
Godfather. They're coming in with baggage, right? Just like
mhm,
people coming to Barry Lyndon are going with Kubrick baggage, right?
yeah.
They have expectations of how somebody who's got that much talent and has done what he's done is going to deliver. And this movie is very far from The Godfather. And it's
Oh,
very
yeah,
far from Apocalypse Now, right? It's very far from those
yeah.
70s movies that defined, Coppola as a director. And I think that this movie is like comical. Yeah, it's dealing with this romance in a kind of smutty way, but also laughing at it and laughing at itself. And it's simultaneously horrifying, but also um silly. I don't know. So and those are not like The Godfather is like the most like I don't know, just stayed dramatic,
Very
yeah,
serious.
serious thing. And so I think that tonal difference is so jarring, and that might explain at least a little bit why when you come to a movie like this, from that you're thinking this is very strange.
In so many ways, The Godfather stylistically is so much more of a traditional horror movie than Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Mhm.
Like, if you
Mm.
can imagine, I mean, there have been these films, but, like, over the years, like, so many horror films have kind of adopted this kind of very grave, serious, chiaroscuro, suspenseful, grim mood, which is The Godfather. Um, and I think in his case, he was trying to do something different with it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about because Justin, you pointed out to me the intercutting parallel between The Godfather
Yeah,
and
the
and
final sequence of The
the Five Little
Godfather.
Things of the
Yeah.
God Cup, which
The
has a
with the
religious ceremony with the
baptism. Yeah.
baptism, and this in which Mina and Jonathan are getting married while the three men and Van Helsing are killing Lucy, right? And it has like the propulsive drama that the Godfather part has, but like it ends on a visual joke of the roast
Yeah.
beef being set down,
Yeah.
and then a flashback to like wow what happened with Lucy, and then there's just a couple seconds of the men just like wiping their brow like that was
Yeah,
weird.
with her head,
With
her
her-
severed head on top of her body. Like, it's super funny.
Se cunoneroava lui Dumnezeu mina cu robul lui Dumnezeu Ionatan, în numele Tatălui și al Fiului și al Sfântului Duh.
I condemn you to living death, to eternal hunger for living blood.
In so many ways, he is doing what he did with The Godfather, though, which is to take something that has been presented in one way over the years and finding a new way to present it,
Hmm.
and that new way somehow being informed by kind of what's come before, not in that genre but other genres. Because at the time of The Godfather, like nobody made a gangster movie like that before, and and I think that so in that sense, I think he is doing something interesting with Bram Stoker's. Yeah, I mean, it took me years to realize what he was doing because, I mean, at the time, you watch it and you see like he's using, um, silent movie techniques and things like that. But the thing that I hadn't realized at the time, I was aware of it, but I didn't put two and two together. Was that like the '80s was a period of a lot of like silent movie reconstructions and restorations and things like that. A lot of film, in
Mm.
fact, Coppola himself had restored and re-released Napoleon, Abel Gance's Napoleon in the early '80s. And then like with the arrival of home video, there were so many more silent movies on the market that you could watch. And I'm sure, Coppola was familiar with this stuff from before, but like everything from, I mean, films that wound up influencing this. I mean, there was a big major restoration of Murnau's Sunrise in the late 80s. And then, Murnau's Faust was on video, and all these films that had kind of come back into consciousness, I feel like, in many
Mhm.
ways. But then also the sort of the Sam Raimi school of just like, you know, gonzo comic horror had sort of taken over, and that stuff was actually really influential in Hollywood in the 80s. And so in so many ways, I feel like he's doing what he did with The Godfather, which is sort of like remixing and combining sort of the styles that have sort of built up head of steam at that time, and finding like channeling them into this thing. And there was this period, and I had a similar reaction actually. I don't know if it's that year or I think it's the year later, or maybe 2 years later. Scorsese's The Age of Innocence, which has a similar kind of weirdly sort of constructed, almost silent movie sort of structure, um, and not structure, but style, and makes all these weird formal choices where you're kind of like, why did he make it like this? Like this story is such a different type of story than the story than what he's telling on screen. Um, and I think it was even like there was I believe a New Yorker critic, I don't remember who it was at the time, might have been like Terrence Rafferty or somebody, reviewing The Age of Innocence, was like, "This movie reminds me of Bram Stoker's Dracula," you know? But there was this period, like in the late '80s, early '90s, when like auteurs kind of adopted or reclaimed all these silent movie techniques and things like that. I think, George Miller's Lorenzo's Oil was another one of those movies. And it's weird. It's like this brief period of like really bizarre, heightened melodramatic, hyper stylized auteur dramas, which were not always accepted by audiences, but have since, I think, rightfully been seen as masterpieces or near masterpieces or whatever. And it's just a fascinating thing, and I think it proved to he's been proven right. Like, I'd so much rather now see a horror movie like Bram Stoker's Dracula than something like, I don't know, I just reviewed Smile, which was not terrible, but it was kinda like, I don't know, man. Like, do something new with this stuff, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's also interesting too that the film, that right now in the early 90s, as you're saying, there's this sort of renaissance of auteur directors reaching back to find old techniques and incorporate them. Right at this moment when Terminator 2
Mhm.
and whatever and all the CGI stuff is really beginning to
Yeah, Jurassic Park's in a
Jurassic
couple of
Park
years.
is coming up,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Even the movie we last talked about, In the Line of Fire, utilizing digital compositing to bring
Mhm.
together stuff in really subtle ways, but it's there. And this movie, from Laura, from your research, one computer generated effect
I believe
you
so.
found.
Yeah, that's what in an interview with Roman, that's what he said.
Do we know what it is, by the way?
I think it's one of the transformations at the end.
Okay.
They may have like to make this seem, I don't know what
you
he
mean
turns into the bad,
you
or
mean the part when maybe where Gary Oldman becomes old and then becomes
I'm not
at
entirely
the very
sure.
okay,
Maybe
whatever.
that might be right,
But the film is entirely practical effects.
in camera.
In camera practical effects. That's the other amazing thing.
I did not I mean, that might have been obvious to people who had seen more older movies, knew about film history. I didn't, and so my eye was just assuming that would be like the way anything else was made in 1992, like optical printers. Like I just assumed that was how this was done. And then I read that they make a giant Jonathan Harker diary, like each page is 10 feet wide, and then put a little tiny truck,
train,
train on top of it. I'm just like, what?
Yeah,
the
so the scene where he's traveling to Dracula, there's a train where it looks very like low budget, right? But there's a little train going across, and then there's the background, and then you see the eyes and stuff and all that. And then there's a moment when the book is in front of the train, and you can see the writing, but the train casts a shadow. And what they were, I just thought, okay, so yeah, you just composite two things together, right? That's how you would normally do this. But no, it turns out they wanted the train to cast the shadow on the book, so they had to But in order to get everything in focus,
Right, because their original thought was to force perspective, put the book close to the camera, put a train really far
Yeah.
away. But that you don't
it
get
wouldn't
the
be all
shadow.
and it wouldn't get the shadow, and it wouldn't all be in focus. So they just made a giant book. I mean, that kind of stuff is incredible. Like that they're doing, and that they wanted to do it in camera. The other one that's crazy is the the shot, Bilge, where the rat goes across the
Uh-huh.
beam. So again,
Yeah.
I was thinking it's unreal because the rats are upside down. So I was thinking, yeah, it's obviously some kind of compositing. No, there's a double exposure. Like stuff like that is crazy. Where they just double expose and then they just flip the camera upside down.
It does look like unlike anything I've ever seen.
Yeah.
And and then I feel like I watched Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula twice, then saw like Beauty and the Beast and some older movie, and then came back and I was like,
Cocteau.
oh,
Yeah.
and suddenly my eye kind of like understood better what I was seeing. But before I was like, it looks different and I can't put my finger on why. Like it but it does have that sort of like, I think I can't remember where I saw this, but somebody described it as almost like an illuminated manuscript. But it does have that texture that's so beautiful and so strange.
Yeah, I mean, no, you're right. It absolutely was the era of Terminator 2, and Jurassic Park was on the horizon, and I think that also turned people off or surprised people because
Yes.
here is somebody just totally not trying to make anything look realistic, because the expectation at that time was special effects have to look realistic, no matter how crazy they can do anything with computers now. Like I've talked to a lot of directors about this over the years, and there's always this concern in their mind, which is like, whatever I do now is just going to date so much within
Right.
several years.
Right.
And now some directors are really good about this stuff. Like, I mean, James Cameron and Steven Spielberg, you have to kind of put them in a whole other category because, I mean, James Cameron, started his own special effects warehouse, and Steven Spielberg obviously is somebody who's just like marinated in this stuff, and also has, I mean, the top line people working for him, and has the budget and the time and the power to just like keep doing it until he gets it absolutely right. And George Lucas is the same, but even those guys, like, they've had to like re-release movies with like the special effects tweaked and stuff like that. Coppola, I think wisely, and I don't know that this was the reason why he did it, but I think he wisely said, I'm just gonna wind up making something that is just a joke within 2 years if I try to like go CGI and try to make like real effects here. And instead he did something that is, one, very beautiful, but also, and I think that's why I want to say that that's why I was like so attracted to the movie, despite the fact that I was like perplexed and bothered and disappointed by it too. Like, it's still so gorgeous. Like, I would never have doubted at the time that it was a gorgeous movie.
Yeah.
And like Eiko Ishioka's costumes and everything. I mean, the music was great. I bought the CD immediately. Like, all the sort of plastic things about it are amazing. And when you have a film like that, it's going to pull you back no matter what. And you're going to keep coming back to it. And over the years, you're going to sort of understand what's going on. And you're going to start forming your own like little relationship with the movie, almost like a very personal relationship. And I think that's a very I don't know that that's how he was thinking of it, but that's how it sort of plays out for me.
I can't imagine that wasn't on his mind, because I mean, I think that one of the things that my sense, having read interviews like yours with directors, is that they don't want to make a movie for today, right? They're interested in making a movie for tomorrow and so on. And the other thing is, there are people who, at least the generation of directors that are mostly the ones we, are with now, and of course there's younger directors now, but these older directors, they all grew up filming real things, and they understand the difference between putting running film stock through a camera that's exposing on a real object and the digital thing. And our eyes seem to know the difference. It's very hard to fool our eyes in this regard. There's a weight that you get from real objects, and that holds up in a way that the digital stuff tends not to. Now, that may change, because now we're in an era where the digital stuff is very good and all that, but there's something about just like the weight of a real object, the way light is, hits it and everything, and the way that ends up being exposed on film, that's just somehow like, we've had 100 years of this, and it's familiar to us in a way. Like, we've learned how to watch that, and so it's incredible, and also it's how our eyes work and stuff. So there's something very familiar to us. Digital is very different, and digital just looks so, especially digital CGI stuff. There's something unreal about it immediately, and we can sort of accept that unreality to a certain degree, but it's still there. I think and especially it's in the 90s it was 100% there. I mean, for all the amazingness of the CGI effects in Terminator 2, you can tell it's CGI. It's like very clear it's CGI. I mean, it's incredible CGI, but it's very clearly CGI. And so I think that has got to be a part of it. And I think the other thing that Coppola seemed to be interested in with this film in particular was the illusion. So he was very interested in the fact that this is a moment in time in Victorian England when there was this kind of, explosion of spiritualism and magic and also science, and these things were colliding in the society in interesting ways. And I think this idea, like Coppola himself has said, like, this is about, I wanted to make a movie that was sort of captures the idea of illusion. And he said the whole movie is an illusion. But by illusion, he meant like sleight of hand, not like digital illusion, right? Because of course, that's another way to have illusion too. But illusion in the sense of sleight of hand using the old techniques. So like the whole thing is filmed on a soundstage, right? So you have all these sets and things which for instance, just the chase scene. We were rewatching the chase scene yesterday at the end, and after we had seen a little back behind the scenes of Coppola, and he's like, "Yeah, all we were doing was just, the studio's not that big. We were just running the horses from one end to the other, and then reversing the camera and running them back, just basically running around in circles." And it kind of feels like that in the, but it also doesn't matter because you're sort of drawn in by the illusion. We sort of know how to overcome that illusion, I think, when we're watching a film, because we've, all the films that, especially from the era he's emulating, are just soundstage films, really. So this is so familiar. Anyway, I think that's a big part of it as well, is like allowing us to just accept this illusion because something about it is really familiar to us.
Absolutely, because I mean, if you think about the theory of the uncanny, a word that we toss around a lot when we talk about genre and horror and things like that, but the uncanny really is built on familiarity, like something you're familiar with, it's something but there's just something off about it, and that's kind of the idea here, right? Because the effects are not trying to be realistic, and because the whole movie is about illusion and things like that. Like for example, the those scenes where Gary Oldman's Dracula and Winona Ryder's Mina are like having dinner, right?
Mhm.
And behind them are those like weird puppet like dancing figures on a screen. And like in some ways it calls to mind Max Ophuls' Letter from an Unknown Woman, where the characters are having dinner, and in the back there are these guys kind of like churning these vistas by them, where it's like conscious of the effect that's you're conscious of this effect, but
Mhm.
also because the figures don't look realistic, you're just like, okay, I feel like in my mind there is an idea of what this would look like if this was realistic, and I'm watching it and it's clearly not realistic. Something is wrong. And I'm uncomfortable and I'm scared. Like it's not, it's like an almost like it's a different kind of horror. It's not a oh my god, I'm scared, it's dark and like Dracula's gonna jump out type of horror, but it's a kind of like I don't know what's going on here. Like I don't know what's gonna happen next. Like
Mhm.
I don't know what this guy's gonna do. I don't know what this camera is going to cut to next. Like it's not so much suspense, but this like heightened sense of uncertainty and discomfort while you're also being presented with all these beautiful images. So it's like being drunk in a way.
Yes, that's
Mhm.
exactly it. No, that's exactly it. And another scene that's like that is, it's because he uses, it's like the film lulls you in to this sense of like, now play by my rules. And here's how my rules are going to go. Everything's going to look kind of fake. But as a result of you now accepting things that are going to look fake, I can mess with stuff. So like when Dracula and Jonathan Harker are first in that room together and the walls start moving,
Hmm.
The
and
shaving scene, I think.
the shaving
Yeah.
scene, yeah, and the walls are moving and they're kind of going, and you're just like, oh my God, like, is that supposed to be happening or not? Like, or is that just a mistake, right? Like, is this,
Yeah.
Or like,
it's
do I
just-
need to like take my contacts
do I need to
out?
take my contacts out? Like,
Like,
what's
what is
going on?
happening? Yeah.
And
Yeah, like why are the shadows all off? It's like, did this $60 million movie like not have an editor?
yeah,
Is
and
there like, did somebody fuck up? And it's
yeah,
like, no, of course not. Like everything you're seeing is absolutely what you're supposed to be seeing.
exactly, yeah,
They're not idiots.
that sort of shows itself. Like the shadows aren't matching, and you're like, what's going on? And then there's that moment when obviously Gary Oldman's like running around the side of the camera, but the eye line, Keanu Reeves' eye line stays on his, like, he'd be looking stage right, as if he's still there and the shadow's still there. But then he looks up and where is he? Oh, he's over here, stage left. And that move is just so good. And it's such a subtle move. But again, the film has lulled you into thinking, look, first of all, I knew the shadow wasn't really his shadow. I knew that because it wasn't tracking exactly with him. But then I was lulled into thinking it was his shadow because the eye line stayed the same. And then when he goes over here, I'm surprised. But of course, I shouldn't have been surprised because I knew it wasn't the shadow in the first place. That's the kind of like brilliance of these little subtle things that he's able to do with just the artifice of everything.
Just a little aside, I think Keanu is really great in some of those scenes. I like his little sort of bland, disturbed little facial expressions he makes when he like looks for the count on one side and he's like, oh God, he's over here now.
Your firm writes most highly of your talents. They say you are a man of good taste. And that you are a worthy substitute to your predecessor, Mr. Renfield.
You may rely on me, Count.
Well, and that's another thing. Like the performances in this film over the years have grown, and because I remember at the time, I think we all kind of liked Winona Ryder. Like she was pretty good, but like Gary Oldman was like so over the top, and Anthony Hopkins was so over the top, and then Keanu Reeves, which by the way, I've talked to dialect coaches over the years, and among them they like to have like a little ranking of like the worst accents of all time, and Keanu Reeves in Bram Stoker's Dracula is like always at the top of the list because his accent is so bad. And back then, I mean, this is another thing. I don't this is like a weird sort of historical thing that like when I mention it, people think I'm gaslighting them. But like back then, there was a real question as to whether Keanu Reeves could act. Because it was like he was great in Bill and Ted, he was great in Parenthood, he was great in River's Edge. So he was like really sort of, but then he started doing like these period pieces, and it was kind of like, what is going on? This like surfer dude, like he's just totally miscast in these parts. And then there was, there were quite, and then later on, there were films where like, people would be divided over whether he was good or bad, But like, I think everybody agreed at the time that like Keanu Reeves looked completely lost in this movie. But again, that sort of adds to the weird artificial quality of it, right? Because like, he's not, I mean, I think he was probably trying to do like a really good British accent and just maybe doesn't have the range to do it, or didn't back then. I don't think he's tried one since. But it just like, now it kind of works. Now it works.
I think like, I mean, we were talking about Keanu before because I think that's the big debate here is like, okay, Oldman's good. Anthony Hopkins is amazing. Okay, but what about Keanu and what about Winona? But here's the pitch for Keanu, I think. So this movie, the way it positions itself, which is not how it is in the book, right, Laura? You can
not
confirm
quite,
that's not quite how it is in the book. But the way this movie pitches itself is it's a love story. It's not a love story between Mina and Jonathan. It's a love story between Mina and Dracula. So Jonathan he's kind of like he kind of gets cuckolded, right? Like he's he's the wet blanket guy on the side who's not very sexy. He's not got any real appeal to him. He's just like a sensible guy, right? He works for whatever. He's like a lawyer or whatever. Solicitor, whatever that means. And
lawyer.
And she gets caught up with the way sexier, cooler, mysterious guy, Dracula. And so Jonathan, he can't be any more powerful of a screen presence because he can't compete with Dracula. He has to basically like wither in Dracula's shadow. And I think Keanu does it. He seeds the shadow to Gary Oldman by being so bland. You believe that Mina would go for Dracula, even though we initially meet him, he's all wrinkly and creepy, but he's definitely got more going on than Jonathan Harker in this film.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it works in that sense. I think back then, because he was a bigger star, your eye just kind of went to him. So you're kind of like, why is he doing anything?
He should be doing
like,
more. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. But the other thing I wanted to mention, though, the other thing you said about special effects with CGI, like I'm not an anti CGI person. Like there have been so many great CGI effects that I've seen in films, and so many films that like use CGI really well. And a lot of it has to do with the director's facility with the stuff. I think Coppola just wasn't a guy who knew that much about how to shoot for CGI and didn't want to sort of concede his vision. But I do think that the other thing about CGI is it honestly, to this day, the stuff that tends not to date is the stuff that allows itself to have that picture book quality. Like
Mhm.
CGI doesn't have to be realistic. Like Titanic, I mean, the effects in Titanic are great, but I recently rewatched it, and the thing, like and I remembered even back then the effects in Titanic very often, especially like during the daytime scenes, like the vistas of the ship on the ocean, they looked very fake, but they
Yeah.
were beautiful. Like they were like picture postcard fake, and that was okay. I didn't mind that. So I feel like if you try to make your CGI hyper realistic and you don't quite, know how to pull that off, um, that can be really, that can be really problematic. I remember, I don't know if guys saw it a couple of months ago, I interviewed Paul W.S. Anderson about Event Horizon, which is a movie I love, which is another one of those movies where like everybody hated it at the time, and
Yeah.
and over the years, people have come to love it. But one thing he talked about was, I mean, there actually is some CGI in that film, and now you can kind of see it. Like there's some really cheap looking effects in it, but a lot of the big effects are actually not. They're like models, scale models,
Mm.
and some things that were built actually to size. And I don't know if you've seen the film, but the sort of the core drive, the third containment, as it's called, that giant rotating ball thing at the center of it. He was like, "We built that thing." Like he's like, "We built that thing, and it moved, and everybody thought I was crazy for doing it, but you know what? It still looks
Looks
great."
good.
And yeah, and like that was the thing that I carried away from that movie. As much as, I mean, I love Event Horizon, but the thing I walked away from Event Horizon was like, that fucking ball thing was awesome. Um, and over the years, when I think of Event Horizon, that's the thing I think of.
Yeah.
And sure enough, you watch it again, it still works. It's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a real thing that moved, and it looks fantastic, and it hasn't dated. If that thing had been like CGI back then, there's
Yeah.
no way that movie would have survived the test of time.
Right.
It
You know?
would. Yeah.
Roman Coppola talked about, like, when they were on set being like, "We know that if we do this right, it will work, because 'cause they've been
Yeah.
doing it for 100 like, we
Yeah.
have no question
Right.
of, like, is this gonna look good?
Plus, you
Are we gonna be
see
able to pull
it.
it off?"
You
Yeah,
just
you've got
see
it
it.
right there. He's just like, if we follow directions, right, from 1897, this thing's gonna look
Right.
good.
Yeah, yeah. It's like why, you were mentioning Beauty and the Beast, but you were talking about, I think, the
The
Cocteau Beauty and the
Cocteau.
Beast,
Yeah.
Yes.
but it's also why, classic Disney movies still look fantastic. They look better than
Yeah.
the later Disney
Cell
movies, because
animation.
the cell animation, and I mean, a bunch of like hundreds of people laboring over this thing for years and
Yeah.
just like animating every single frame. I mean, I'm sure it drove them all crazy, but like, hey, it works.
It looks very good. Well, the other
Yeah.
thing you mentioned, Bilge, that I think is really interesting to think about just in terms of CGI, because the effects stuff is really important, but maybe it isn't as much CGI versus practical, but it's embracing the limitations of the technology or trying to
Yeah.
hide them, right? So I always think about like the use of digital and early use of digital film and how a lot of times they would try to hide, make it look like film, and it wasn't
Right.
ready to do that right, and then it would just kind of have this kind of ugly look to it.
Mhm.
But then you see something like film we're very fond of, like Miami Vice or
Mhm.
or Collateral, which embraces that digital look and says, "Hey, I'm going to create some palette with this thing that I have, which is like a new tool. It's like a new paintbrush. Let's use it for and sort of show it off in the way that it can do it, and not try to make it look like anything else." Maybe
Yeah.
that's the similar thing of like, to what you're getting at with the CGI, with like make it look in a way like CGI, or just embrace what limitations you have. So you can't do photorealistic CGI. Okay, then let's make it, look kind of stagey or whatever. And in
Yeah.
a way, what Coppola's doing here is just sort of saying like, well, for the things that I needed to do CGI, I couldn't do. So I'm going to embrace the like limitations of what I could do, which are going to be like, shadow puppets and these sorts of things. And I'll just show you them. I'll show you the illusion, but you're nonetheless still going to be gripped by it. And it's going to have a certain like quirky, nostalgic vibe to it. And so, that's what I think we're picking up on today is we're thinking, oh, that's
Mhm.
so like quaint and cool because nothing looks like that. Much in the way that when people watch Miami Vice today, they're like, wow, that's at the very least quaint and cool looking because nothing looks like that movie, right? Because
Yeah.
nobody really was doing that.
like Lars von Trier movies, from
Yeah, the
from the
Dogma
90s,
stuff. Yeah.
the Dogma films. I just had to watch like all the Dogma films a few months ago, and it's amazing watching that stuff now because at the time we processed that stuff as, oh, this is really realistic, like this is hyper realistic, this is edgy, this is
Right.
gritty, this is like raw reality. And now you watch something like The Celebration and you're just like, this is the most stylized movie I have ever seen. Like there's nothing realistic about this. It's just like, I mean, it's like camera, like the mic guy bumps into the camera at some point. It's just crazy. And back then it was like, oh, this is really raw and real. And now it's just like, oh wow, like there are choices being made. Like
Totally.
this is wild. But it still holds up. Like it doesn't, because it holds up because they embrace the technology, and
Yeah.
they might not even have been entirely aware of how people 20 years, and I think this is probably true of Coppola as well. You don't necessarily know how people 10, 20 years from now are going to accept what you're doing.
Yeah.
But if you embrace the technology, if you embrace the limits of the technology, and if you embrace its qualities, there's an honesty there.
Yeah.
You're not like pretending to be something you're not.
Yeah.
And there's like an honesty and an authenticity that just conveys itself to the screen, conveys itself to the audience. I mean, it's almost like a mystical connection, not a mystical connection, but there's just, it's weird. Like it's, as humans, we can kind of tell when somebody's like, lying to
Like
us,
phoniness. Yeah, we have like a sense of
Yeah,
phoniness.
phoniness.
And I think,
Mhm.
yeah, it's I don't know. That's the thing about this film that I love so much is it's incredibly earnest, and yet it has this sort of silly, kind of jovial tone to it. I mean, everything with Van Helsing is so over the top, and apparently Coppola says that was like, him. He was like, in a way, or was maybe Hopkins was saying this. I can't remember, but anyway, basically he was pushing Hopkins to be weirder. He wanted him to.
Mm.
He wanted him to go even weirder, right, and make more choices and be more stylized, right, in this character. And look, have you read Dracula, by the way?
I
Bilge?
have. So actually, in my great anticipation run up to seeing Bram Stoker's Dracula for the first time, I read the novel
Uh-huh.
back then. It's been a while, obviously. I don't remember it too well, but I remember I was kind of disappointed by the novel.
Yeah. So this is what we were, because Laura's been reading it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I really tried to do my homework. I'm like 3/4 of the way done my audiobook. I'm sorry.
but-
It's 18 hours
but-
and I started it last week.
What we
but-
were getting though was from this, what Laura was kind of confirming is how much. Do you feel like Coppola is getting the tone, that all of this kind of the melange of the silly, but also the horrifying and the sexiness that's in the book?
Yeah, but he's taking it to like 11.
He's like pushing it, right?
For sure.
Further.
Yeah, Van Helsing in this is like sometimes inappropriately weird, but he's more folksy than lurid, where like I feel like Anthony Hopkins is like still got like a little bit of Hannibal Lecter left over from the
Well,
last movie.
I mean-
He's just like smelling Mina at times and like humping, Quincy or whatever. That it's a much more like a sweeter old man who like tells a too long story about corn in the book, but also like kind of gets the giggles after Lucy dies inappropriately.
Right, because he's like a weirdo who's really interested in dead people, and he's a scientist, but he's like a weirdo scientist, right?
Yeah.
Here we are, young man. Lucy is not a random victim attacked by mere accident, you understand? No. She's a willing recruit, a breathless follower, a wanton follower. I dare say, a devoted disciple. She is the devil's concubine. Hey. You understand me?
Yet, we may still save her precious soul. But, not on an empty stomach. Jack!
Yes, sir.
I starve. Feed me. Oh, coot!
No, because I was going to say the other thing is like he's not. I mean, he's able to sort of make himself disappear and in the cemetery, but also he's in that opening scene.
Right.
You
Yeah,
probably noticed
yeah.
this, like he's one of those old priests in the opening scene, and it's very clear in that opening scene that it's him.
Yeah.
Which is kind of just like a little in joke, but but then you have this weird sense, oh, like, is he also an immortal? Like, has he
Right.
just been
Yeah.
chasing,
Van
you
Helsing
know?
knows a lot of stuff. How long has he been
Yeah.
around?
That's funny. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I just thought it was double casting, just like with Mina as Elisabetta, and so then I was
But like, is the soul of Elisabetta and
Oh,
Mina?
I see. Is
And
this
in some of them, like,
reincarnation?
is
Mina is
Van Helsing
Elisabetta
like,
in a
yeah,
sense, right? Yeah.
the descendant, the spiritual descendant? I kind of thought that was a possibility.
But what's interesting about that hypothesis is that the guy who he is, I don't know his name, whatever, the guy who is the Anthony Hopkins is playing in that earlier scene,
Mhm.
he's a priest, right? So
Yeah.
and I would have thought that Van Helsing would have been opposed to that, because the way I see it is like one of the themes of this film is like the sort of spiritualism versus science. So there's like the kind of the empiricist who comes in and is skeptical of stuff, and then there's the spiritualist who's like, we can converse with the dead and all this stuff. And I was thinking that Van Helsing is on the side of the science, and Dracula is on the side of the spiritual.
Not quite, because
No,
the thing is that so maybe the person who's the most science is Seward, Richard E. Grant, the one who runs the lunatic asylum, because he's the one who pushes back against Van Helsing, and Van Helsing says, like, you have to be by the very fact you are a scientist, you have to admit that there are things in this world you can't understand. And he's actually making a case for the fact that spirits exist, that faith is real, that there is so much in our world that we don't understand, and it will not perhaps ever be explained by science. So, and and like, he is sort of an exorcist too, right? Like, he brings in his crucifix and he gets Lucy back in it, right?
Yeah. He uses whatever tools he needs.
Right. Yeah, but I think he's a believer.
He's chopping off heads and stuff, like he's doing the things that myth tells you need to do, not science.
Yeah. I guess I thought of him as like someone who's like empirically confirmed that stuff. So now, right? He's like he's not just like reading the text and is like, this is what I do. He's like, all right, let's go figure this out by actually testing this hypothesis. And I think that's what he's so excited. He's like, we get to chase a vampire and like see if these things are real.
Sorry, let me just like go to my notes really quick.
Laura's got some notes on this.
Well, because I don't know much about the Victorian period, I'm going to be honest with you, but I was interested in this sort of like this intermingling of the psychological sciences and the physical and and the hard sciences, as we might say.
Yeah,
and how there was
this day that divide remains.
Right, but like how there sort of seemed like more of an open playing field in the Victorian times, because there's such a big explosion of technology and science that people were like, well, maybe like also ghosts are real. I don't know. I have a telephone now. And it's crazy.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right, because I mean, I'm not so much nowadays, but I used to be obsessed with the Victorian period as a kid. But I was really fond of like just Victorian era literature, and I was a huge Arthur Conan Doyle fan. And Arthur Conan Doyle was he was a doctor who created Sherlock Holmes, who was obviously this hyper rational, very scientific figure. But then later years, Arthur Conan Doyle became a spiritualist.
Yeah.
He was one of the foremost proponents of spiritualism, and he got in. I mean, there's actually a whole movie about this called Photographing Fairies, but he got sucked up in that whole sort of. And I'm not going to try and summarize this history because I don't even remember all of it, but this person who was convinced that he could photograph fairies, and Arthur Conan Doyle was involved in this stuff, and a lot of that had to do with the trauma of like losing his son during the war and stuff. But I mean, if you think about it, these were all sort of upstanding Victorian people, and as such, they might have been doctors and scientists and whatnot, but they were also religious because it was a very religious time, and so so there has to be some kind like, okay, you're a scientist, you're a doctor, and obviously the science and the medicine of any era is completely limited by what we know of that period. And 200 years later, they all look like quacks. But so you've studied science, you've studied medicine, you have all this knowledge, but then you also believe in all these other things, which people obviously still do. But back then, it was such a more pronounced belief in God and heaven and hell and demons and like ghosts and things like that. So like at some point you have to become convinced, I would imagine, that there is, like, if you're a man of science but you also believe in ghosts, then you probably think that there is some point at which you will be able to scientifically prove
Sure.
the existence of
totally.
ghosts.
Yeah.
Like,
Totally.
otherwise, you'll go crazy.
Yeah.
I would
Right.
I mean, or you you just drink a lot and turn off your brain. But I feel like I would go nuts if I held those two beliefs in my head. I would lose my mind.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's like, I love that, like, Dracula kind of. I mean, obviously it's a 1992 movie, so it's it can treat all this with the appropriate level of irony, but it feels like a film that's like caught between that. Like,
Mm.
it. I mean, it's a movie about vampires and vampires being real. And it's got ghosts and demons and giant monsters that turn into rats, but it's all created like in camera with like scientifically kind of
Yes.
sound effects.
Right. Right.
And I
It's
love
like
that,
it's
like
real
that,
and it's not real at all. Yeah.
yeah, like again, that uncanniness I think speaks to just the general mood of that era.
Yeah. The Society for Psychical Research. That's what I was looking for. A
Right.
group in 1882 that was set out to investigate and prove, like, to be, to be real, the claims of mesmerism, spiritualism, and authenticate ghost stories. And William James was a part of it. Like,
wow.
scientists were like, we're going to find a scientific way to prove that this stuff is real.
Yeah. I mean, to bring this all back around to horror, I mean, I think one of the aspects that we find so scary about things is things that are inexplicable, right? Things that just don't fit into our worldview, that we can't make sense of, either our religious worldview or our scientific worldview or whatever. And what I think is, in this movie, you sort of see these characters confronting something that is, in the case of Lucy, her being, her just like loss of blood, and they're like, what is going on? And she's acting so strangely. And that confrontation with the unknown, that I think sparks a lot of the horror of the movie. And we're actually coming up next on this podcast, just a heads up, we're doing The Exorcist, but it's the same kind of, the horror in The Exorcist is the confrontation with this unknown of, for me, actually, the horror is the parent being like, I have no idea what's wrong with my kid, right? That's like just so deeply unsettling, and finding no scientific explanation for it, and ultimately then turning to faith as a way to manage it. There's something I always get when I watch this movie, which is there's something like terrifying about the fact that there's a vampire here. And then when Van Helsing shows up, you're almost like reassured that it's going to be okay, because Van Helsing knows what's up. He's like, nah, I got it all figured out. I got a system. Here's this and here's that. Here's what you need to do. And suddenly it becomes reassuring again, and like stability is restored. And that's like that push and pull. And then the horror kind of vanishes a little bit, or it's muted. And because I can be like, okay, Van Helsing is going to save the day. And I think anyway, that's partly why I think part of the horror is the inexplicable, is that like when it becomes explained, it's somehow like manageable. We're like, okay, I can sleep now.
Well, is it reassurance, or is it kind of a sense that wait, like, are things about to get even crazier because this guy showed up and he's supposed to save the day, and he appears
And
to be
he's
an
crazy.
even bigger lunatic than anyone else.
Maybe that's right. That's not the attitude that I have when I watch this movie, but I like that too. I like that
Yeah.
approach too. You're like, oh shit.
Like, you're like, wow, I feel even more uncomfortable now. I feel even more
Yeah,
unsafe now.
that's definitely
This
like-
fucking psycho showed up.
I guess here's why I think this way. I'm like, if I was like, imagine you're like lost. Okay, you're lost in the woods or something, and then you find someone who seems to be like, they're there and they're crazy, but they seem to know what's going on. Then I'm
No.
suddenly less scared. I don't know, but maybe
Really?
I'm a lunatic. I'm suddenly less scared. I'm just like, okay, you'll take care of
So
this.
when
right?
you meet like a forest person, you feel good? I don't know.
know.
about that.
Yeah, I would follow the
Yeah.
forest person.
I feel like there's a whole tradition of cinema that this attitude goes against.
Yeah, and then they are taken
Generally
into
speaking,
the.
forest people don't turn out to be.
Then they're
very
sacrificed,
helpful.
and
Yeah.
But I don't know what it is though.
Oh,
when I'm just
Justin.
like, I feel like, okay, I'm reassured. This person's confident. They're confident, right?
You like
Yeah.
that confidence.
I like
Yeah.
the confidence. He's just like, let me explain this to you. I got this huge book. It says vampire, and it seems to be made out of human flesh. I'm like, okay, this guy knows what's
Well,
up.
no, I know what you mean though. There is the sense that he, and I think maybe it even speaks to the fact that he's the thing we mentioned earlier, which is that he almost seems to be a semi supernatural figure himself.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, okay, we have our own Terminator now. Like it's like we have our T-800.
Yeah.
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 Is it was he a T800? I can't
Yeah,
remember, but
T800,
whatever.
yeah, or T100
Yeah,
model
so like
800.
we
I
have
don't know
our
what he
own,
is.
so at least we have a shot now, because this guy seems to like be in tune with the things that we maybe are not. But no, I get what you mean. At the same time, I do think that there's the sense that like he makes the film even more unpredictable. So
Yes.
you just don't know where it's headed,
Yes.
even though it's such a familiar story.
Tonally, he just like upends the film, because now all of a
Mhm.
sudden, like, everything has been played pretty much deadly seriously until he shows up, and then you're like, what? Which is
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
I mean, I'm just thinking in
And
particular.
at
Yeah,
that point, he's still Hannibal Lecter too.
I know.
Like that's the thing. It's just a year after Silence of the Lambs, um, so there is like he's really playing against type here.
Yeah. Oh,
Like
I was thinking.
he's out of control.
I was thinking this performance in a way harkens back to parts of his some aspects of his performance in Elephant Man. I mean, especially
Oh,
the
yeah.
scenes where he's doing he's in the amphitheater with
theater.
the doctors,
Yeah.
right, and that kind of thing. And I was thinking, like, but then he mixes in the Hannibal Lecter, and I imagine for American audiences at the time, those would be the two performances that you would associate with Hopkins. Just unless you knew a lot about his television work or whatever, but like those are going to be the two ones that jump out, and in a way, this film sort of blends the two together, and but and takes it in a totally different direction, because he's so wild, but he's such an anyway, my point is just that he's such an interesting counterpoint to Oldman, who's so serious and so theatrical and so alien in a way. And so even though Hopkins is a weirdo, I don't know, it's like he's goofy, so you're like, I don't know, I love that dynamic between the two of them.
How did Lucy die? Was she in great pain?
Yeah, she was in great pain. Then we cut off her head and drove a stake to her heart and burned it, and then she found peace.
Doctor! Please.
I mean, that's the thing about Hopkins, is that somebody there in that crew has to play up to Oldman's level.
Yeah.
Otherwise it's just not gonna. It would just fall flat. It would just be weird. A bunch of like Cary Elwes and Keanu Reeves like cowering while Gary Oldman goes crazy. Like that's just weird. So you need somebody on that other end to just like give as good as he gets.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
it's Anthony Hopkins.
Wait, so could we also talk about Tom Waits? Sorry, I just like
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
what what an amazing, strange performance in which he could have very well shot his. Am I misremembering? Could he have shot all of his scenes separate from pretty much everyone except for Richard E. Grant? Is he in it?
He talks to Mina once.
Yeah, so like that's incredible.
Yeah, he
like
could've, yeah.
he's just in that crazy sanitarium setup, which is also an amazing feat of scene setting. But yeah, I find the Tom Waits performance like the one where I always forget that, oh shit, Tom Waits is Renfield in this, and he whenever he's on screen, it's just kind of magnificent. I don't know, I find it like he's right in the tone of the movie, I think, and even though he's not interacting with many of the other characters, he just like understands, I know exactly what kind of movie I'm in. I'm going to play this in the sort of strangest way, but in a way that's familiar to the 90s. So it feels like he's a Terry Gilliam film.
I was
basically.
just about to say Terry Gilliam, in particular, like with the set, like the whole conception of what the lunatic asylum looks like,
Yeah.
and the guys with the cages on their heads. What?
Oh yeah.
Why is I don't know what's going on there.
It seems like a Gilliam touch somehow.
Would you care for an order, Dr. Third, or canapé?
No, thank you, Mr. Renfield. How are you feeling tonight?
Far better than you, my lovesick doctor.
Is my personal life of interest to you?
Of course it is. All life interests me.
Your diet, Mr. Renfield, is disgusting.
Actually, they're perfectly nutritious. You see, each life that I ingest gives back life to me.
Yeah, and Gilliam also is, especially back then, was kind of famous for practical effects and just. I mean, he was a guy who was always conceiving of films that were way more ambitious than the budget he would have. So he would have to just kind of play around with just like the goofiest little effects, which basically created the Terry Gilliam aesthetic, But also, I mean, which also comes from his animation, which was like, cheap cutout animation. Like he wasn't actually animating anything. I mean, it was great. Um, so yeah, no, I mean, I think that's the thing about Tom Waits is, I mean, that was another thing that at the time we were just completely
Yeah, I
blown away
imagine.
by.
Yeah.
I mean, he had done a bunch of Coppola films at that point, so he was kind of a Coppola regular. But like, this was, I mean, Tom Waits was always a kind of, I mean, marginal musical figure, but like people knew who he was. And like if you and I would argue this is maybe the period when people knew him the best.
Mm.
And he had done like, Jim Jarmusch movies and things like that, but but he was always kind of this very deadpan figure, and which was very much in keeping with the style of music that he had. And so for him to be doing this performance is just fucking crazy. I mean, I'm trying to think of who would be, I don't know. Like I'm trying to think of like an artist like Sufjan Stevens,
Mm.
doing like, I don't know, like
Eating
a La
bugs.
La Land musical or something.
Yeah.
Or playing Renfield. I don't know. He could have played Renfield. No, but like there's just like something so off about this. And that's like really, I mean, that's one of the very first things you see. And it's like, that's your first sign. Okay, this movie is going to be very strange. They've
Yeah.
got Tom Waits as Renfield eating bugs. I mean,
Yeah.
that's just messed up,
With the glasses too, it's really, really
Oh, yeah.
great. And then you get a couple POV shots through the glasses with the distorted
Yeah.
lens shape and
He's got a
everything.
British accent. They gave Tom Waits like one of the most distinctive voices ever. They gave him a British accent. It's just so weird.
He's so fully in the character, and like him stammering when he's like talking about the master, and and he's like not sure if he should have said that. And I just think it's like it's such a ticky, quirky performance, but yeah, but it is interesting because I forget about it. I don't know if that happens for you guys, but I always forget that Tom Waits is in this movie,
Mhm.
and then I'm like, yes, it's like the cherry on top for me when I'm reminded of it. Um, but yeah, and so okay, I want to ask one other thing, which is so just to come to the like this is a movie about vampires, right? Okay, so
Uh-huh.
vampires are in this movie, and I'm curious, like we've had a lot of vampire fiction in this world, and you know what is it about the vampire in particular? So, the vampires, they're very sexy. They are also very scary. They're also us, right? So vampires are us that have been mutated, right? So they're not like creatures that are sort of alien.
Mhm.
And they're not, I guess they're dead, but they're not dead. They're undead, right? So I don't know, they're in between the living and the dead. It's unclear what their sort of spiritual status is. Are they damned or can they be brought back? It's unclear. And then they have this like unquenchable thirst for blood, partly because I guess, well, I think thematically it's sort of because maybe they're always searching for their lost humanity. That's the way I think of it. Like they're just like that's why they want blood. Is it's like the thing they don't have. They don't have any human blood anymore, so they have to seek it out. And and yet they're super appealing, right? Like there's something appealing about being non-aging, immortal, having super strength, being able to like seduce people with just like a look of your eyes. They have cool powers. So I don't know. I'm curious, like what it is about vampires that draws us, and how this film sort of capitalizes on that, or doesn't, because maybe it doesn't. Maybe this film isn't a good vampire movie. Anyway, I'm curious what you think.
In terms of like the sexy vampire, I mean, they weren't always sexy, right? I mean, Nosferatu, Max Schreck,
Not too
not a
sexy.
sexy guy.
Not too
Like
sexy.
I wouldn't classify him. I don't know. I don't know. It's like maybe standards of beauty have changed, but I'm pretty sure Max Schreck still qualifies as not
Not sexy.
You know,
The fingers don't really do it.
Mhm.
yeah. I mean, but there is, and I don't know, I mean, I don't feel like Bela Lugosi at the time was considered sexy, although I don't know, but like the sexy vampire thing, I feel like, I mean, there's obviously the original Dracula has a little bit of it, but I feel like that concept was, wasn't a big thing over the years. That sort of comes back a bit later. And obviously you've got the Anne Rice novels by this point,
Mm.
and I mean, while while Bram Stoker's Dracula is being made, like people have been trying to make at that point Interview with a Vampire. I mean, Neil Jordan makes it a couple of years later, but people were trying to make that film for years. So so I think Coppola is tapping into sort of a vogue for sexy vampires at the time. And I think people were really shocked. Like I remember one of the very first stills they released of the movie was this shot of Gary Oldman, young Gary Oldman, with his bare chest, and like Winona Ryder basically like her head right here, and that was one of the very first stills they released from it. In fact, the tagline. In fact, before you saw anything from the movie, you would see these years, like a year before, they had these posters that were just like this. It wasn't any character; it was just like this sort of weird fanged figure statue with the words "Love Never Dies," and was that was the way they sold the film well in advance. And I remember we were all very kind of perplexed by that. Wait, love never died. Wait, what does love have to do with Dracula?
Interesting, yeah.
And so it was interesting to see the film at that point. Obviously, I think it's like an incredibly sexy movie. But I think it's also, or maybe more than sexy, it's a horny movie.
Yes.
It's a very horny movie.
Yes.
Like horny is the word, maybe not sexy, but I mean, sexy is in the eye of the beholder. But horny, I'm pretty
Yes.
sure objectively, it's a horny movie.
Yes.
But yeah, and Coppola was was not a director I ever thought of as like a director who kind of had a facility with that sort of thing, even though there was like, there's stuff in his very early movies, but and in fact, one of his very first films, I believe, was like somebody spliced in like softcore scenes into it, so it was like released as a softcore movie. So he even had a reputation for that, even though it was not something he had ever done with the film. But like it's interesting that he sort of went in this direction and really leaned into it in this film. Right down to, I mean Sadie Frost's character, and then the three. I mean, like that shot of like the three the vampire brides who just like kept Keanu Reeves prisoner. He's like there in chains, and he's got these three women over him. Like one of them is Monica Bellucci, and he's like narrating this letter. It's like, oh my god, it's so awful. I'm so trapped. This is like the worst thing that's ever happened to me. You're watching it, you're like, I don't know, man. It seems like a pretty good deal. But the film plays around with that kind of stuff. And the cast is really attractive.
Yeah.
I mean, Gary Oldman, in prime Gary Oldman era. I don't know. I think all that stuff works, but then there's also the idea of blood. Obviously, this is the early 90s. The AIDS epidemic is still with us. I mean, it never really went away, but and I remember and that's actually one thing that I think speaks to the way that the film's reception has changed over the years, because the film makes enough kind of veiled references to that idea, but it doesn't really explore it, I don't think. I mean, it's like these kind of grace notes almost, and it informs the film in certain ways. But at the time, I remember it felt almost glib. It was kind of like he's trying to add. I don't know. It got me thinking, because I was watching the movie again last night, and it got me thinking about how like the idea of topicality can really sort of change the way you view a film over the years. Like you can watch something, like when you're in the middle of something, you can watch a film that's like maybe a Hollywood film or something like that, that treats that idea that's like in your mind. And it can either feel like, oh my God, this film really gets it. This film gets it how I feel. Or it can feel like this is trying to sort of be relevant in a way that actually makes it feel less relevant and makes it feel slightly out of touch. 20 years later, though, that feels like, oh, this is an interesting thing this movie is doing with like the mood of the times, with the spirit of the time, because you're like distanced from it and it doesn't feel as raw.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that I was thinking about in terms of the way this film sort of evokes some of the imagery of the AIDS epidemic. It felt at the time like he was grasping for a kind of significance that the film didn't quite warrant, or that the film didn't quite achieve. Now it's kind of touching, it's like it evokes that period, and it's kind of touching in that way. But back then, when like we were all in the middle of it, like I mean, when I was like a teenager during the AIDS era, it was gnarly. And it was kind of like, ugh, this is like, I'm not sure this is working for me. Whereas now it's kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, this is actually an interesting thing this movie is doing.
I wonder on that point. I wondered if there was an attempt to like draw a parallel between both the sort of moral and whatever panic about the AIDS epidemic, because there was a moral dimension to that, of course, and the kind of whatever is going on in Victoria era England, where there's this kind of repression of sexual desire that is coming out with Mina and Lucy's. They're like taking a peek at the Arabian Nights illustrated edition, which has all kinds of Kama Sutra stuff in it, and that there's. And then if you're thinking in those terms, then the vampire is like a stand-in for the barbarian at the gate, right? The thing we're trying to keep out by doing all this repression in high society, where we don't talk about this stuff, and we sort of look askance at at behavior that we deem immoral, like being promiscuous and that kind of thing. And so I wondered if that was what he was trying to tap into, is that like, really 100 years apart, we're kind of rehearsing the same moral panic again, right? In a way, it's just not, and now we understand the scientific basis of it. Back then we didn't, right? There were venereal diseases and so on, but we didn't understand, so we was spirits and that kind of thing. And now we have a sort of something we can point to. And so that's why he's, because of course the people at the time wouldn't necessarily have thought in terms of blood cells. Maybe they would. I can't remember when as a scholar of the Victorian age,
no,
Bilge, but
I wouldn't.
I don't know if they had microscopes that were that powerful. But anyway, but we certainly, when you show, like if you show images of blood cells, we immediately, it's like, oh yeah, we understand what's going on. So anyway, I just wondered if maybe he was trying to do something like that.
Well, also emotionally, I mean, there's that scene at the time which really sort of rang out of, because we talked about how, I mean, do vampires have blood? Well, Dracula does, right? Like he cuts his hand and blood zips out. But that scene with Winona Ryder, where he's, he slices that gash in his chest, and she's about to suck on it and become a vampire, and he steps away, and he's just like, no, I love you too much, and it's like, I mean, it's very campy, but it's also like right there is like, okay, here's this very sort of stark and resonant image of somebody exchange of bodily fluids that is going to transform one person into something that maybe they don't want to be. And this, and he suddenly is like overcome with love for her. And of course, then she does actually suck on it and take me away from all this death. Which is a great line, which was in the trailer. I'm still not sure. Like, I'm like, I don't know if you're taking her away from all this death, but it's a good line.
Yeah.
Please, I don't care. Make me.
Marry you because as I am to walk in the shadow of death for all eternity. I love you too much to continue.
Take me away from all this death.
I mean, Bilge, are you a fan of Gothic horror?
I'm a fan of Gothic horror in terms of films.
Okay.
I haven't read a lot of Gothic horror. It's one of those things that I'm like, oh, I'm totally gonna read this. Like Northanger Abbey and all. Like I bought all the books, but like I never actually read any of it. But I love the style. I feel like I remember. What was that film? The Guillermo del Toro movie.
Is it Crimson Peak?
Crimson Peak. And I remember reviewing that, and at the time, I really felt like, I feel like this film is missing a few too many things for me to be able to fully embrace it. There's all sorts of stuff I love in it. Doesn't really work in the end. There's a lot of stuff that I feel like the film thinks I'm shocked by and I'm not, and things that the film thinks are unpredictable that are like super predictable. So I don't think he achieves what Coppola ultimately achieved. But then again, I wouldn't have said Coppola had achieved it back then. So who knows?
It's
Maybe
hard to
maybe my
know.
opinion will change over the years. But it is one of those things like it's a form that is in some ways like missing some of these like maybe conventional things that I look for, but the surfaces are so fascinating and beautiful and compelling that I keep being drawn back into it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that's a really interesting way to make movies. It relates to this thing, and I think I mentioned it when I wrote my Miami Vice piece, and I mentioned Whit Stillman's
Yeah,
appearance
yeah.
on your podcast when he talks about the not normalness of movies like Bram Stoker's Dracula. I think I included it in that
Yep.
in that piece, but Bram Stoker's Dracula is like a classic not normal movie,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
If it's like the big release that weekend, and you've been waiting for it for a year, and you've seen the trailers, and you have the posters, and you did all the shit I did, and then you went and saw it, you're like, "What the hell? Like, what is this?"
Yeah.
But then over the years, you go back to it, and without that sense of anticipation and without that sense of trying to place it in the context of like contemporary releases, and is it better than the thing I saw yesterday or worse, or is it, you know, when it's plucked out of that continuum, I think the film really shines, and I think that's what Stillman was trying to get at,
Yeah.
when he talked about how, this was Last Days of Disco, right, that he was
Yeah.
talking about?
Yeah. He was talking
And
about
that was
this.
a film I remember I saw that opening night, and I
Yeah.
remember we were all kinda like, "Okay, I think that was good. What? I mean, it was alright," and, we all loved Metropolitan and Barcelona. It's not like that movie is all that different from those, but we were expecting somehow for it to be like a Wet Stillman movie that somehow fit within the context of like current releases. And it's like, oh, we got a Whit Stillman movie, and it took a little while to appreciate it properly. I
Yeah.
think I think he was absolutely right, and I think this is one of those movies where it's kind of like, oh, right, you
This
know.
is this is making me think we need to rewatch Cloud Atlas, Justin.
No, we're
Speaking
going
of
to.
Keanu and directors who make movies that I come in with expectations and then
totally.
I'm confounded by and then like need more
The
time on.
Wachowskis are, I think, another
Oh yeah,
team that has made so many movies that, are the kind of things that are misunderstood initially and then come to be recognized. I mean, Matrix notwithstanding, that was obviously a
Yeah.
massive hit, but I mean, Matrix 2, Matrix 3, even Matrix 4, I think, and then especially Speed Racer, and then,
Speed Racer
yeah,
is the one. I mean, the
yeah.
Speed Racer is the one where they're just like, I mean, the other movies you can kind of convince yourself that they thought they were making like a kick-ass action movie and maybe didn't quite pull it off. But Speed Racer is a movie where you're like, oh, these are choices. Like
Yeah.
they did exactly what they wanted to with this thing, and it either works for you or it doesn't. It's I mean, I think it's fantastic.
Yes. Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to note was, in terms of what Coppola did, in the idea that we talked about earlier of him, um, taking kind of a familiar genre and trying to reinvent it in a new way.
Mhm.
When you look back on his career, it's kind of like he did this before too. Like, I mean, I mentioned The Godfather, but I was just watching The Outsiders, and The Outsiders is
Mm.
is like you watch that movie and it's like he made this like he films it like a 50s melodrama, and I think that that's in 1982 or whenever it was that he made it, that was kind of a or 84 or something. It was kind of a shocking thing to do. Um, so I feel like it's something that he's always really sort of tried to do with certain films, like when he has the chance to, especially when he's working, I think with like a literary property, where he's like, okay, I have something that is popular and people have some kind of preconception of it, and I am going to do the exact opposite of what they're expecting. Like I think that's a thing that he does. I think when he's adapting things.
Mm.
I don't know. I think it's an interesting thing to look at in the context of his career in that sense.
That is interesting. And it's also like something to compare with someone like Kubrick, who was famously only did adaptations. And like,
Mhm.
I think in the case of it, I'm just trying to think. I haven't this is a new thought to me, so I haven't really sussed this out. But um, I mean, in the case of Kubrick is he is sort of yeah, taking a lot of liberties with a lot of his adaptations in ways that I think are quite interesting. I think what was interesting about Coppola in this case, for me, is that you, tonally he is sort of shifting things, I think, a lot. But what was interesting is we watched this interview with him, and maybe he even said this to you when he talked to you, but he said like he wanted it to be Bram Stoker's Dracula, like above the title, Bram Stoker's name, because I want to venerate the author, right? The writer is like they're doing so much work, it's such an important thing, so I want to show my fealty to them. That's why the name's above the title. And yet at the same time, I think you're absolutely right, Bill Good. Like he's taking this and sort of it's all being filtered through and reinvented in this interesting way, shooting it in a way that as if he were shooting it at the time of Bram Stoker almost, but also injecting with all this extra stuff, the romance and all that, all the sexiness and everything. I don't know. It is like, and yet it does feel faithful. That's the other thing that I think is right. I feel like he's capturing the mood of it. We were actually I just mentioned one other thing. I mean, we were just talking about Lord of the Rings because we just did our Lord of the Rings miniseries, and one of the things we were talking about was like what makes those movies such a good adaptation. And one of the things one of our guests, Robin Hansen, said was, it just captures the mood of the books. Like it's not necessarily about fealty to exactly what happens, and the events are rearranged and stuff's cut. But it's just like it somehow captures exactly the themes and tones of the book. And I mean, Laura, you can vouch for this. I mean, you just read it. So, but I mean, I do feel like it captures, at least in my mind, it evokes what I have in mind when I think about the Gothic horror novel. Even though I'm not like an aficionado of these. So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I told you, Justin, I was joking about Jonathan Harker's diary, talking about the first time he encounters the weird sisters and her mouth moves down, down, down to his neck. Like it's sexy, but in a Victorian way, and Coppola's
They're
like
showing ankle.
right. Yeah. There's a whole scene where like when the scene where Lucy wanders out, she's definitely not having sex with the beast in the book. Like that's not like there's a whole thing where Mina's afraid people are going to see her without her shoes on. And so she puts her feet in mud. So the people, like if they see her, they think like she might be wearing shoes. Like
right.
it's Victorian, but like it is sexy, right? For sure. And
for
like
the time.
And Coppola was like, I read this and I'm gonna turn it up to 11, as I said. Like I think absolutely he understands what this novel's doing, and he's just doing what he can do with it in the 21st century.
But what's cool about this, and just to your point, Bilge, it's not that he's taking it and putting in 1992, which would have been to use CGI and whatever. I mean, the only thing that's like reads 92 about this is Keanu Reeves and maybe Winona Ryder. But it's like right? It's still like old, but it's updated. I don't know quite how to describe it. It's both at the same time.
It's like you can't like quite focus in on like where you are in space and time, and that's what kind of makes it amazing
and timeless.
Right.
Yeah.
I was also wondering, do you guys think this movie is scary or no?
I think it's kind of scary. Yeah. What about you, Bilge?
I don't think it's scary in the traditional way. I mean, I would classify this as a horror movie that's not scary, or I don't even know if I could call it a horror movie in that sense. But I would say that it's. So I had this thing I wrote years ago about Mulholland Drive. It was a thing. David Edelstein and I at Vulture had done a list of like I think it was like the 50 greatest horror movies since The Shining, I think. Or I don't know if it was 50. It was like 33 or something. It was however many years had passed since The Shining. And we put Mulholland Drive at number 1. And a lot of people objected to that because they were like, Mulholland Drive is not a horror movie. And first of all, I thought that was insane. But it made me kind of think about why I thought Mulholland Drive was a horror movie.
Yeah.
And the thing I mean, one, it's a horror movie because it contains the 2 scariest sequences I've ever seen in my life. I mean, that's it's like scarier than any horror movie, any other horror movie. But the thing that really jumped out at me as I wrote about it, and I also kind of watched a lot of other horror. I mean, I had watched a lot of horror movies for this list. But I realized the thing that makes a horror movie, for me at least, is a certain feeling of helplessness, right? I mean, it's not just a character's helplessness, but the film has to create a sense of helplessness in you. Like, not helplessness in terms of necessarily like being able to help the characters or anything like that, but like you're watching the movie and there is a certain point during the film where you feel like I could leave. Like I maybe I should leave. Like maybe I should turn this thing off because it's like it's too dark. I'm a little terrified of what I'm going to see, and it just pulls you, right? No other movie does that really. Like the thriller works something else. Like there's a suspense is different than that. But horror at some point there has to be a sense of helplessness, like helplessness
Mhm.
as a viewer, kind of watching the movie. Um, and that I mean that because there's a certain like you know fight or flight instinct that takes over, and
Yeah.
I think that sense of helplessness is tied into that. There's a very visceral sense of helplessness that you get while watching a horror movie, watching a successful horror movie.
Yeah.
But they're all trying to create that on some level. And I think the thing about Bram Stoker's Dracula is it's not so much that there are scary scenes, but there is this sense of like, I don't know where this is going, and I don't know where it's taking me, and I feel afraid and I feel helpless, and I'm really uncertain, and it's weird and kind of scary, but not really scary. Um, that's where I think it works as a horror movie, although I would not say it's a scary movie in that sense.
Yeah.
It's just the sense of entrapment and helplessness as you're watching a horror movie.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I find it a really unsettling movie, but the
Yeah.
reason I asked about the scary thing is because it struck me. Um, we watched a couple of Coppola interviews and we read yours, and I think he made this joke like a couple of times. Whenever he talks about Bram Stoker's Dracula, he's like, "Oh, I could go to Romania and do it in the castle, but then Dracula was gonna get me." And he kept joking about it, but I was like, I think this man is scared of Dracula.
Yeah, no, I think
And he says that too,
yeah.
right? Like, because when he went to go see movies as a kid, like those are the ones that like really got under his skin. And I was and weirdly enough, I also had a moment where I watched there was a TV show on Nickelodeon, I think, called Are You Afraid of the Dark? There was a vampire one. I like did not sleep for a week. It really messed me up. But I was just thinking about like that thing where you first encounter like a real terror as a kid, and it's often something when you look back on it, like that was so hokey, so silly, so smoke and mirrors-y, right? Like so fake on the out, and but you have this naivete that contributes both to like the awe and the wonder of it, and also the deep in your bones terror. And by playing into like the tricks of sleight of hand and the way the movies were filmed from the time closer to the time that Coppola was watching those movies. I mean, obviously he was not watching movies in the silent period, but it just seems that there's like an interesting mingling for him of like that childhood nostalgia and terror that somehow still like remains in the movie and connects with me as well. I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah, no, totally. I just thinking about if it's scary. I don't know.
I would say unsettling, not scary.
Unsettling for sure. I think it is scary. I don't know. It's different from a jump scare, as you pointed out, and it's not
Yeah.
suspense, Bilge. That's totally right. But what is scary then? I don't know. And I like what you said. This thing. I don't have much to add. I think that's really cool. This idea that like you feel helpless, and for me, it's also for me the scariness and the horror comes from the sort of confrontation with the uncanny and also the inexplicable. Just to go back to the thing I said before, and I think that's the bits that I'm like, oh yeah, this is scary. Like Lucy as a vampire, she's walking down the steps backwards. That stuff's very strange and unnatural. She vomits up blood. That's very gross, and I'm just that's not I don't like that. And she's also moving every time she's moving backwards, right? Like her getting back into the coffin is just reversed.
Oh yeah.
It's just there's something creepy about that really
And the sound design.
it just like bugs me. But I'm also it's not the kind of fear where I'm like I have to turn this off. I'm just like yeah, this is cool. I like it anyway.
Because of the artifice is so on
Yeah,
so
well,
on the
because
surface.
it's pretty, it's beautiful too. It's not like when I'm watching a slasher film and somebody's getting murdered. I'm like, this is not really that beautiful, it's just terrifying. But it's quite, it's painterly, it's gorgeous.
Yeah, yeah. It's like the giallo films have a bit of that quality. I mean, the
Mhm.
good ones have that,
Mhm.
are very, aesthetically pleasing, but it's also like
Yep.
horrible. I mean, it's like you watch it and it's like, oh my God, what a beautiful shot. Oh my God, there's like a woman with her throat slit.
Yeah.
It's like there's all these sort of creepy things happening in them. I mean, the design of this film is wonderful, and even though we talk about the artificiality of things. There are certain things that are not artificial. Like the makeup is fantastic.
Yep.
I mean, it still holds up, and
Yep.
it's incredible special effects makeup. I mean, old Gary Oldman. I mean, my God, like he looks realer than young Gary Oldman. I
Yeah.
mean, it's incredible. And like the thing with the hair. I mean, design wise, I mean, that's scary. Like, and that's that's an image that has, you know, persisted. I mean, it's even in Hotel Transylvania. They have that in Hotel like that image of the.
Whatever
Like,
the
of
bouffant,
course, he's been
whatever that
around
is.
for like 600 years. Of course, his hair would be long.
Yeah, he doesn't have anyone to
it's
cut
got
it.
A bun. He's got it in a terrifying bun. That's really scary. Like all those things, and he's wearing a fucking kimono.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, all this stuff is. It's just. I mean, you're right. There's the uncanniness. There is the sort of. It's all very unsettling, but it also like visually, like physically, it's scary. Like the plastic elements are
Yes.
scary.
Can we also
And the way the music is beautiful, but the way it
Oh,
builds
the
and things like
music.
that, and those sort of Eastern European motifs. I mean, it's all beautifully done.
For sure. Can we just talk about really quickly who's he got cooking food for him? Because he doesn't eat, right? But there's like a whole chicken. It looks nice, a roast chicken and some salad and everything prepared for Jonathan when he shows up.
Yeah, I
Does
don't know.
his vampire brides do this?
This
cooking?
is part of the vampire question because Jonathan Harker is also convinced that he has no servants because he doesn't see any, and he's like, what? But also like I don't know that he's preparing chicken. He also has a lot of like locals that do his bidding.
Yeah. Also,
but
who's
I
the
don't know.
carriage person? Is that like a demon?
It might also be Dracula. That's what Jonathan Harker thinks.
Yeah, because in Nosferatu, it's him. Like in
Okay.
Nosferatu, it's Nosferatu. It's it's Count Orlok who's driving the carriage as well.
Okay.
I think that I mean, it's like that's like the Bond villain thing, right? It's like okay, the Scaramanga, who's cooking the meals? Like or the guy in I can't remember his name. The guy in Spy Who Loved Me. I'm just like these are some elaborate seafood dishes. Like how big is the kitchen staff, and did they die when the thing blew up? Because that seems like pretty bad collateral damage. But yeah, it's a thing. It's a thing in the movies.
Gotta have that. Well, Bilge, on that note, thank you very much for joining us. And remember, folks, if you want to read Bilge, the place to go is New York Magazine /Vulture. And Bilge, do you want to tell the folks where you are on social media?
I am at Bilge Ebiri on Twitter, and that's kind of where you would find my public-facing persona. But yeah, I mean that's the place to find me and to yell at me.
Yeah, don't yell at Bilge. No. Bilge only has good takes. And but thank you very much for coming on again and talking about this wonderful movie with us. A movie which I'm sure this conversation could go on for 6 more hours, but I think we need to let you go and Laura needs to go to sleep. So
I do need to go to
yeah,
sleep.
but thank you so much. And we are at CowsPod on Twitter. You can find us on the web at cowspod.wordpress.com, and you can get a cow shirt at cowspod.threadless.com. And in 2 weeks, we'll be talking to Carly Severin. Carly's coming back again so soon to talk about The Exorcist. So we will see everyone then. Bye.